So, in your book there is an emphasis on journalists being unassuming, and that's it comes across as a good thing. But obviously, young journalists, there's a pressure to get noticed, and we wanted to know what was your advice on getting the line between getting noticed and coming across as obnoxious.
So. Well, my thing about being unassuming was really about presenters. You get to a certain stage and they begin to feel that they're important and they need to be reminded that they're not. I don't take that advice for you at this stage. That's not relevant. You just need to be. You definitely need to be likable, I think. I mean, if you're going to be in a small office working with other people, they need to enjoy working with you. So I do think that's important. But I also think you've got to be ambitious and probably forceful. It's a really hard industry now. It's contracted. At the same time as it's contracted, you've got so many more people training for it. Everyone seems to have decided they want to be in the media. And so I think you need to be, I always say to people, be very single-minded and very flexible, which is a bit contradictory, but I think if you aim for one thing, by the time you get there, it may not exist anymore, because you're going into a very rapidly changing industry. And be yourself.
Great, good advice, thank you. Considering during Book Festival, me and Becky were really interested as to what your favourite book is, or if you have a favourite author.
When I was at Durham, I did my dissertation on an author called Bernard Malamud, who is an American Jewish writer who's wrote brilliantly ordinary stories about ordinary people doing ordinary things, but wrote them in an amazingly compelling way. So I thought he was incredible. I've just really started reading books that are true, and not fiction. So I read recently a book which I love by David Marinus called They Marched into Sunlight, which is about a platoon in Vietnam that went into the jungle and got slaughtered by the Viet Cong. So I think that's a sign of aging now. I'm starting to read books about things that actually happened instead of made up stuff. Yeah. But when it comes to novels, what did I read recently? I just thought I'd better read Joe Nesbo, The Snowman. I read that, like thrillers. I read the Stieg Larsson trilogy. I've got a Kindle and it's slightly transformed my reading. And I got all of Dickens' books for 45p, and I read the Pickwick Papers, and it brought me to tears.
On the Kindle note, we were discussing technology changes how we consume books in relation to Durham Book Festival. So obviously you read on a Kindle. Are there any other quirks like locations you go to? Just as in a matter of trying to get people more involved in books for the people who do think it's relevant. What kind of quirks? How do you read?
The Kindle's changing because I can carry it everywhere. I've got it somewhere on probably got it on my person now. So I do think having the book with you for the spare moment is the key thing. And when I wrote my book, I thought at first I'd get a laptop and I'd sit in my study and I'd do 3 hours a day, but it's really hard to cut the time aside because you go and sit there and the emails pop up and all that. So instead I wrote it on my phone, and it was an iPhone, and I wrote it like that, and it's I don't know how many 100,000 words or something like that. And I found the technology really helped me there because it meant that wherever I was, if I was in a queue, if I was having a cup of coffee, I would write a paragraph. And pretty soon, after about 6 months, I had a whole book. So for me, it was an amazing thing to write it on something that small. But as to reading, they always say you need the feel of the page, don't they? And I think I wouldn't want to write off paper just yet.
Right.
I'm still wary of taking my Kindle on the beach because the sand might get in the sprocket.
Another question, we're broadcast journalism students, and for part of our modules we have to create and produce current affairs programmes, and we were just wondering, for you, what are the key elements that we should focus on when doing our programmes, like the structure or the interviewees? What do you think is the most important?
The key thing is that your programme needs to discover something. Right. So there's no point repeating things that people already know. So you need to find some area that interests you and that has some ability to discover. And the most compelling programmes in current affairs are ones which involve secret filming, no question about that. We're joking on Panorama at the moment that we think we've now secretly filmed everyone in Britain. So we've run out of people to film. We even had a vets film where we were secretly filming dogs the other day. So we've actually run out of people. But I think there's always this tension between working out whether you just go somewhere with a camera and discover things and you sort of film what happens and you bring it back and you try and make sense of it, or whether actually you sit in an office and you work out what the story is and you plot your structure on your chalkboard or whatever, your whiteboard, and you say this is who we want and this is what we want them to say, and you go to the interviewees with a very clear idea of how and then you get a much clearer programme, but it's also somehow, it doesn't feel quite right because you've been in control of it from the start. So I think that in an old-fashioned way, I'm a fan of the first thing, which is that you take a camera somewhere interesting and you film what happens, and you can even be surprised by it yourselves. I think there still is stuff to find out in this country.
Right, yeah.
I think there was more stuff to find out in the 70s when life was a lot more untidy. People are much more conscious now of the danger of exposure if they're doing something they shouldn't be doing.
Yeah.
There's a lot more regulation. There's a lot. You can't do a thing on dangerous building sites because they're so regulated.
Yeah.
You're not going to find people not wearing hard hats on building sites. So, what do you do? Where do you start?
In terms of target audience, how do you make it relevant to Radio 2 listeners, current affairs? Because obviously targeted audience is key, really. So what elements make it relevant?
That is a very good question, Becky. Yes, you're right. They are. Although I wouldn't overdo the idea of the target audience. If you've got a conversation with the Prime Minister, he's probably going to be interesting to anybody, anywhere. So we don't need to think. Should we wait? Does the Radio 2 audience want to hear from the Prime Minister? We don't need that thought process, you know. And I think it's interesting. Different programs have different DNA. There was a piece we did on Newsnight once about the fact that BMA, the British Medical Association, is striking off a disproportionately large number of foreign doctors. And the question then asked by Newsnight was, is the BMA racist? I then go to Radio 2, 5 years later, the same story crops up. The BMA is striking off a disproportionately large number of doctors. And then the Radio 2 question is, why are we letting these doctors into the country in the first place? And I thought that's a good example of how different programs do have different DNA, as you're suggesting. But we can overthink this. Fundamentally, is the story interesting? And if it's interesting, it'll be interesting on Newsnight, it'll be interesting on Radio 2. And the reason Newsnight got into trouble on the whole Jimmy Savile thing was because I think they had a thought that maybe it's interesting, but it's not our kind of story for our kind of audience. And actually that was an unnecessary thought, because in the end, it was a very important story.
Another question. We read in your book the interview with Gordon Brown and how it was quite scary. Well, it must have been for you. Have you got any tips for us how to deal with staying calm when we have scary interviews?
Well, he was probably more scared than me in the
Yeah.
sense there's more at stake for him, you know, and he's Prime Minister trying not to lose an election. I'm just a radio presenter, so I think in life, you know, I noticed that some people in life they've just got self-assurance. I'm not saying I'm one of them, by the way. I think I probably had to work at it.
Yeah.
But there are people who can go into a room and they're not fazed, and I think that is quite important. Because, and clearly neither of you are phased talking to me here, which is a relief, you know, and quite right too. But yeah, you don't want to be a nervous interviewer, I should say. So sort of having the sense that you've got every right to have this conversation with this politician or broadcaster or whatever is quite an important part of it. I think, you know, if you've booked an interview and you've got a camera and they've agreed to it and you're doing it, or if you're outside their house and you're doorstepping them, you've got every right to be there, you know, so you've got nothing to apologise for. So I think if you feel a lack of assurance, you should work on that. Yeah, but I don't think either of you do.
No.
I think it'll be fun.
Finally, who is the one person you would love to interview who you haven't already?
The person I would like to interview who I have not already is called Philip Petit, and he is the man who went on the tightrope across. Oh, that's good. Across between the Twin Towers. If you've seen the film Man on Wire, he's the French guy who put the tightrope between the Twin Towers, and he walked across. And he's in France somewhere. And whenever we have somebody on work experience, they always say, "What can I do?" And I always say, "Can you book Philip Petit, because we want to interview him and no one has yet." One day someone will do it. And I don't think he's unavailable. I think he's just not got a phone or something. But we just can't track him down. And I just thought what he did was absolutely unbelievable. To think that he put that, and it was about half a mile up, a third of a kilometre up, on a windy day.
Terrifying.
You've seen the film, yeah?
Yeah.
Incredible. So he's one.